Let us study that true Bible as we count it, of the human body and of the nature of man. Andreas Vesalius. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to read from The Anatomy of the Psyche, Alchemical Symbolism in Psychotherapy by Edward F. Edinger. But before I get into that, let me just mention a couple of things. This week we began our seminar in the advanced reading group on Mysterium Conjunctionis, which we conduct on Zoom. This text is complicated but extremely interesting when you know that Dr. Jung found that medieval alchemical images show up in modern dreams and help us understand what our self is trying to say to us through dreams and visions. So I urge you to join us in the advanced reading group. Also, all of the 32 weekly seminar sessions we've completed on Ion, researches into the phenomenology of the self, and Mysterium Conjunctionis are available to all members of the advanced reading group. And so all you have to do is write skip.conover@gmail.com. And please do support this YouTube channel by sharing videos you like with your social network, particularly Reddit, Twitter, and Facebook. Please subscribe below. We want to maintain the benchmark of having more than 50% of our viewers as subscribers. And we obviously also welcome Super Chat sponsorships on all live streams. Hello, Joseph. Welcome. Nice to see you today. And so I'm going to begin my reading. And this quote, which I began with, is at the very beginning of this book, and let me read it again for you. Let us study that true Bible as we count it, of the human body and of the nature of man. Andreas Vesalius. So I'm reading from Anatomy of the Psyche, Alchemical Symbolism in Psychotherapy by Edward F. Edinger. And the reason alchemical symbolism is so important is because the alchemists had put down what was coming up in their own dreams and visions through their process. Now, they didn't understand that it was a psychological event that was occurring. They just thought they were working with metal for the most part, or at least that's so we think. But what Dr. Jung figured out in the 19-teens is that his patients were having the same dreams, essentially the same dreams as people in medieval times, and that if he studied what the alchemists had found over 1700 years, he would be able to understand what was going on in the psyche of his patients. So today I'm going to read the introduction to this book as a way to interest you in getting the book and reading it for yourself. I've given the full name of the book in the discussion of this video below. Introduction. The process of psychotherapy, when it goes at all deep, sets into motion profound and mysterious happenings. And I would just say as an aside, anytime we study archetypal matters in Jungian psychology, that can happen to you. It certainly happened to me in 1993, and I didn't really know what was going on. So you need to be aware that you can set off things happening in your unconscious It's not necessarily unhealthy, but you can start having visions and very vivid dreams, and you should be prepared for it. Edinger continues, "It is very easy for both patient and therapist to lose their way. This is why narrow and inadequate theories of the psyche are clung to so desperately. At least they provide some sense of orientation. If we are not to submit psychic phenomena to the Procrustean bed of a preconceived theory, we must seek the categories of understanding the psyche within the psyche itself. We must seek the categories for understanding the psyche within the psyche itself. An old alchemical dictum says, 'Dissolve the matter in its own water.' This is what we do when we try to understand the process of psychotherapy in terms of alchemy. As Jung has demonstrated, alchemical symbolism is largely a product of the unconscious psyche. The real nature of matter was unknown to the alchemist. He knew it only in hints. Inasmuch as he tried to explore it, he projected the unconscious into the darkness of matter in order to illuminate it. While working on his chemical experiments, the operator had certain psychic experiences which appeared to him as the particular behavior of the chemical process. Since it was a question of projection, he was naturally unconscious of the fact that the experience had nothing to do with matter itself. He experienced his projection as a property of matter, but what he was in reality experiencing was his own unconscious. As Jung studied alchemy, he found that this luxuriant network of images was, indeed, the psyche's own water, which could be used to understand the complex contents of the psyche. He wrote, quote, "I had very soon seen that analytical psychology coincided in the most curious way with alchemy. The experiences of the alchemists were, in a sense, my experiences, and their world was my world. This was, of course, a momentous discovery. I had stumbled upon the historical counterpart of my psychology of the unconscious. The possibility of a comparison with alchemy and the uninterrupted intellectual chain back to Gnosticism gave substance to my psychology. When I pored over those old texts, everything fell into place. The fantasy images, the empirical material I had gathered in my practice, and the conclusions I had drawn from it. I now began to understand what these psychic contents meant when seen in historical perspective." Now I want to share with you another page here. At the end of Mysterium Conjunctionis, he sums up the meaning of alchemy. The entire alchemical procedure could just as well represent the individuation process of a single individual, though with the not unimportant difference that no single individual ever attains to the richness and scope of the alchemical symbolism. This has the advantage of having been built up through the centuries. It is a difficult and thankless task to try to describe the nature of the individuation process from case material. No case, in my experience, is comprehensive enough to show all the aspects in such detail that it could be regarded as paradigmatic. Alchemy, therefore, has performed for me the great and invaluable service of providing material in which my experience could find sufficient room, and was thereby made and has thereby made it possible for me to describe the individuation process, at least in its essential aspects. We can therefore say that alchemical images describe the process of depth psychology, which is identical with what Jung calls individuation. What I thus propose to do is to examine some of the basic images of alchemy to see how they correspond to the experiences of psychotherapy. Okay. We can therefore say that alchemical image... I'm sorry, I read that already. The term psychotherapy is used here in its broadest etymological sense. The Greek word therapeuin, to heal, originally meant service to the gods. Healing thus took place at first in a sacred context. Philo tells us of the group of pre-Christian Jewish contemplatives who called themselves therapeus, either because they profess an art of medicine more excellent than that in general use in cities, for that only heals bodies, but the other heals souls. I'll read that sentence again. Either because they profess an art of medicine more excellent than that in use in cities, for that only heals bodies, but the other heals souls, which under the mastery of terrible and almost incurable diseases, which pleasures and appetites, fears and griefs, covetousness and follies and injustice, and all the rest of the innumerable multitude of other passions and vices have afflicted upon them, or else because they have been instructed by nature and the sacred laws to serve the living God. Psychotherapy thus means, basically, service to the psyche. What makes alchemy so valuable for psychotherapy is that its images concretize the experiences of transformation that one undergoes in psychotherapy. Taken as a whole, alchemy provides a kind of anatomy of individuation. Its images will be most meaningful, of course, to those who have had a personal experience of the unconscious. The alchemical worldview. For the alchemist, upper and lower and inner and outer were linked by hidden connections and identities. What happens in heaven is duplicated by what happens on earth, as indicated in this alchemical verse. Heaven above, heaven below. Stars above, stars below. All that is above also is below. Grasp this and rejoice. Now, what I think that means is that heaven above is in the psyche itself. It has that meaning. And then it also expresses what's out in the world. Okay, reading on. Likewise, a passage from the Emerald Tablet says, "What is below is like that which is above, and what is above is like that which is below, to accomplish the miracles of one thing. The planets in heaven correspond to the metals in the earth. Sun equals gold, moon equals silver, Mercury equals quicksilver, Venus equals copper, Mars equals iron, Jupiter equals tin, and Saturn equals lead. As the planets revolve around the Earth, they gradually spin their corresponding metals into the Earth, which people can extract by their chemical operations." See figure 1.1. So here's figure 1.1. Okay. Okay, now, of course, Dr. Edinger is saying they didn't know what they were talking about. But anyway, this is the way they envisioned it. Okay. Psychologically, we can understand this image as referring to the archetypal constituents of the ego. The building blocks of the ego are divine qualities stolen from the gods or products of the dismemberment of a deity, earthly representatives of transpersonal principles. Such imagery is still alive in the modern psyche, as indicated by the following dream of a middle-aged businessman and commercial artist who had no knowledge of alchemy. Quote, 4 metal-clad figures descend toward me from the sky. They float down over an ancient Roman wall. Each suit is made of a different metal. One is bronze, another lead, another iron, and the fourth is made of platinum. The platinum-suited figure separates himself from the others and approaches. Quote, "We are seeking metal," he says. "The metal we seek matches the metal of our suits." Unquote. The figures remain suspended in the air by some unique method. Unquote. The metal-suited men correspond to the planetary deities of the alchemists. Since they have no weight, they are spirit beings and inhabitants of the sky. Thus, they would represent archetypal images of the objective psyche. Their descent in search of their corresponding metals indicates that each metal spirit is seeking his own earthly embodiment. They want to be concretely actualized in the conscious experience of an individual ego. This is an archetypal dream and clearly has a collective as well as a personal meaning. The gods we have lost are descending on us, demanding reconnection. Like Bacchus and Philemon, modern individuals are being visited by and asked to provide hospitality for the transpersonal factors with which they have lost connection. The dream is also relevant to our efforts to understand alchemy. The spirits of alchemy, the symbolic images that have come down to us, are asking for their earthly counterparts. That is, their meaningful realization in modern experience. Many gifted and devoted people offered up their whole lives to the quest for the philosopher's stone. By understanding the images they served, we can redeem their lives from futility and recognize them to be witnesses to and carriers of the mystery of individuation. So keeping in mind that individuation is the tendency of the human being, the psyche of the human being, to make you become all you're meant to become. So your unconscious is constantly making new cells for your hand and for your eyes, your hair, what have you. But it's also trying to develop your psychology, your psyche, and that's what it's doing in dreams and visions. The opus. The central image of alchemy is the idea of the opus. The alchemist thought of himself as committed to a sacred work, a search for the supreme and ultimate value. The alchemical texts have a great deal to say about the nature of the opus and the attitude that should be taken towards it. Certain virtues are indispensable prerequisites. For one text says, "O all ye seekers after this art, ye can reach no useful result without a patient, laborious, and solicitous soul, persevering courage, and continuous regimen. These are requirements of ego function. Patience is basic. Courage means a willingness to face anxiety. Continuous regimen means that through all shifts of mood and mental state, one is willing to persevere in the effort to scrutinize and understand what is happening. Now, let me... Another relevant text comes from Thomas Norton's Ordinal of Alchemy. For anyone who has had the experience of psychotherapy, the parallels will be immediately evident. Quote, anyone who gives himself up to this search must therefore expect to meet with much vexation of spirit. He will frequently have to change his course in consequence of new discoveries which he makes. The devil will do his utmost to frustrate your search by one or the other of the three stumbling blocks, namely haste, despair, or deception. He who is in a hurry will complete his work neither in a month nor yet in a year, and this art will always be true that the man who is in a hurry will never be without matter of complaint. If the enemy does not prevail against you by hurry, he will assault you with despondency and will be constantly putting into your minds discouraging thoughts. How those who seek this art are many, while they are few that find it, and how those who fail are often wiser men than yourself. He will then ask you what hope there can be of your obtaining the grand arcanum. Moreover, he will vex you with doubts whether your master is himself possessed of the secret which he professes to impart to you, or whether he is not concealing from you the best part of that which he knows. The third enemy against whom you must guard is deceit, and this is perhaps more dangerous than the other two. The servants whom you must employ to feed your furnaces are frequently most untrustworthy. Some are careless and go to sleep when they should be attending the fire. Others are depraved and do you all the harm they can. Others, again, are either stupid or conceited or overconfident and disobey instructions, or they are drunken, negligent, and absent-minded. Be on your guard against these, if you wish to be spared some great loss. A prominent feature of the Opus is that it is considered a sacred work requiring a religious attitude. Quote, this arcanum should be regarded not only as a truly great, but as a most holy art. Therefore, if any man desire to reach this great and unspeakable mystery, he must remember that it is obtained not only by the might of man, but by the grace of God, and that not our will or desire, but only the mercy of the Most High can bestow it upon us. For this reason, you must first of all cleanse your heart, lift it to him alone, and ask of him this gift is true, earnest, and undoubting prayer. He alone can give and bestow it. Now the regimen is greater than the perceived by reason except through divine inspiration. Now the regimen is greater than is perceived by reason, except through divine inspiration. Woe unto you who fear not God, for he may deprive you of this art. Our art, its theory as well as its practice, is altogether a gift of God, who gives it when and to whom he elects. It is not of him that wills or of him that runs, but simply through the mercy of God. Such passages as these make clear that a careful awareness of the transpersonal level of the psyche is required. Seems to be out of sync, unfortunately, but I'm going to keep going. This means one must be self-oriented rather than ego-oriented. This means one must be self-oriented rather than ego-oriented. There is a paradox here, as so often in alchemy and psychotherapy. An awareness of the self and the religious attitude that such an awareness brings are the goals of psychotherapy, rather than requirements at the beginning. However, the potential at least must exist from the start. As one alchemist says, one must start with a bit of the philosopher's stone if one is to find it. As the process deepens, one realizes more and more that insights come by grace, and that development occurs not by the will of the ego, but by the urge to individuation from the self. So, share this with you. Another aspect of the opus is that it is highly individual work. Alchemists were decidedly solitaires. They might have had one helper, but no more. This refers to the uniquely individual nature of individuation. In its deepest aspects, it is experienced alone. The opus cannot be performed by a committee. It thus generates a certain unavoidable alienation from the world, at least for a time. But when God grants his grace to someone who understands the art, this will appear incomprehensible in the eyes of the world, and those who have this mystery will be scorned of men and looked down upon. This corresponds to the work of psychotherapy, which is impossible for anyone to understand from outside. It will be scorned and ridiculed by the collective, conventional standpoint, either from another person or one's own shadow. Parallel to this text are these words of Jesus, quote, "If you belong to the world would love its own. But because you do not belong to the world, because I have chosen you out of the world, for that reason the world hates you," unquote. John 15:16, from the New English Bible. Another feature of the opus concerns its secret nature. The alchemists considered themselves to be the guardian of a mystery that was not to be divulged to the unworthy. Quote, "Therefore you should carefully test and examine the life, character, and mental attitude of any person who would be initiated in this art, and then you should bind him by a sacred oath not to let our magistry be commonly or vulgarly known. Only when he begins to grow old and feeble, he may reveal it to one person, but not to more. And that one man must be virtuous and generally approved by his fellows. For this magistry must always remain a secret science, and the reason that compels us to be careful is obvious. If any wicked man should learn to practice this art, the event would be fraught with great danger for Christendom. For such a man would overstep all bounds of moderation and would remove from their hereditary thrones those legitimate princes who rule over the peoples of Christendom. And the punishment of this wickedness would fall upon him who had instructed that unworthy person in our art. In order, then, to avoid such an outbreak of overweening pride, he who possesses the knowledge of this art should be scrupulously careful how he delivers it to another, and should regard it as the peculiar privilege of those who excel in virtue. Like the illusion mysteries, the alchemical secret was forbidden to be published. Understood psychologically, the matter is more subtle. A secret that can be told is no secret. Okay, so I would just interject here that some of these secrets were perceived by Adolf Hitler, and he conveyed them in his book Mein Kampf and spread them out to his followers in Germany after 1923. And it so happens that we know a very senior and central American official who used to keep Mein Kampf on his nightstand and read it daily. And so my purpose in making this available to you is so that you can help us come up with the antidote to that, because once the secret is out of the bottle, anything can happen. And it's obviously out and has been for most of the 20th century. In a sense, the secret of the psyche is safe because it is not communicable to those who have not yet experienced it for themselves. The misuse of the secret referred to in the text suggests an inflation following the ego's identification with an archetypal image. If the transpersonal energies are not perceived as secret and sacred, they will be channeled into personal ends and have destructive effects. Misuse of the alchemical mystery corresponds to the misuse of the Eucharistic mystery, concerning which the Apostle Paul says, quote, "Anyone who eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord unworthily will be guilty of desecrating the body and the blood of the Lord. A man must test, dokimazo, quote, to prove, to assay metals, unquote. A man must test himself before eating his share of the bread and drinking from the cup. For he who eats and drinks judgment on himself if he does not discern the body." 1 Corinthians 11:27-29, the New English Bible. The alchemical opus was considered a process begun by nature, but requiring the conscious art and effort of a human being to complete. Quote, "This state cannot be perfected by a mere progress of nature, for gold has no propensity to move itself so far, but rather chooses to remain in its constantly abiding body. Nature serves art with matter, and art serves nature with suitable instruments and method convenient for nature to produce such new forms. And although the before-mentioned stone can only be brought to its proper form by art, yet the form is from nature," unquote. This is a profound idea. In one sense, the opus is against nature, but in another sense, the alchemist is helping her to do what she cannot do for herself. This surely refers to the evolution of consciousness. Although the urge to consciousness exists with nature, within the unconscious psyche, an ego is needed to realize fully that natural urge. It is required that the individual cooperate deliberately in the task of creating consciousness. The ultimate statements about the alchemical opus occur in certain texts that equate it with the creation of the world. Zosimos says, quote, "The symbol of chemistry is founded on the creation of the world," unquote. The Emerald Tablet says at the conclusion of its alchemical recipe, quote, "Thus the world has been created," unquote. Another text, after describing the preparation of a special water, continues as follows, quote, "When this has been done, take a drop of the consecrated red wine and let it fall into the water, and you will instantly perceive a fog and thick darkness on top of the water, such as also was at the first creation. Then put in 2 drops, and you will see the light coming forth from the darkness, whereupon little by little put in every half or each quarter hour, first 3, then 4, then 5, then 6 drops, and then no more, and you will see with your own eyes one thing after another appearing and by on top of the water, how God created all things in 6 days, and how it all came to pass, and such secrets as are not to be spoken aloud, and I also have not power to reveal. Fall on your knees before you undertake this operation. Let your eyes judge of it, for thus was the world created," unquote. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Understood psychologically, these texts are equating the individual with the world. That is, they state that individuation is a world-creating process. Schopenhauer begins his great work, The World as Will and Idea, with the outrageous statement, "The world is my idea." Likewise, Jung speaks of the world-creating quality of consciousness. Such an idea is dangerously close to solipsistic inflation, and indeed it is a common content of psychosis. The idea that one is the whole world or the center of the universe. Nevertheless, it is an archetypal idea that the individual needs in order not to be swallowed up by collective statistical standards. Collective thinking is revealed by preoccupation with whether or not one is normal. To the extent that one is a separate, unique world of being, there can be no norms, since a norm is an average of many. The individual psyche is and must be a whole world within itself in order to stand over and against the outer world and fulfill its task of being a carrier of consciousness. For the scales to be balanced, the individual must be equal weight to the world. This realization of the individual as a whole world often comes over me with considerable force as I am working with patients. It is a valuable counterbalance to doubts about the significance of one's efforts with only a handful of individuals as compared to the world population of several billion. Although alchemical writings are complex, confused, and even chaotic, the basic scheme of the Opus is quite simple. It is as follows. The purpose is to create a transcendent, miraculous substance, which is variously symbolized as the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, or the universal medicine. The procedure is, first, to find the suitable material, the so-called Prima Materia, and then to subject it to a series of operations that will turn it into the philosopher's stone. Martin says, I found a doorway through solipsism of sorts in the search for knowledge, and so entered inside. I hope I hope you found the doorway and the way out as well. Sean says, I wonder if the difference would be being part of the world rather than inventing the world and claiming ownership. Well, we have to stay in the middle. We can't have solipsistic inflation, but we also can't have alienation. We have to live down the middle between those two. And in Odysseus, that's the passage between Scylla and Charybdis. Carrying on here, a few more pages. The Prima Materia. The term Prima Materia has a long history that goes back to pre-Socratic philosophers. These early thinkers were gripped by an a priori idea, that is, an archetypal image that told them that the world derives from a single original stuff, the so-called first matter. They differed as to the identification of this prime matter, but they agreed on its existence. Thales called the prime matter water. Anaximander called it the boundless apeiron. Anaximenes called it air, and Heraclitus called it fire. This idea of a single original substance has no empirical source in the outer world. Externally, the world is obviously a multiplicity. Thus, the idea must be a projection of a psychic fact. According to philosophical fantasy, it was then imagined that the prime matter underwent a process of differentiation, whereby it was separated into 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. It was thought that these 4 elements then combined in various proportions to form all of the physical objects of the world. Upon the Prima Materia was imposed, as it were, a fourfold structure, a cross, representing the 4 elements, 2 sets of contraries, earth and air, fire and water. Psychologically, this image corresponds to the creation of the ego out of the undifferentiated unconscious by the process of discriminating the 4 functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Of course, those were picked up by Dr. Jung and later used in the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Aristotle elaborated the idea of the Prima Materia in connection with his distinction between matter and form. According to Aristotle, primary matter, before it has been wedded to form or had form imposed upon it, is pure potentiality, not yet actualized, because the actual does not exist until it is taken on a particular form. As one commentator of Aristotle puts it, quote, "First matter is the name of that entirely indeterminate power of change," unquote. The alchemists inherited the idea of the Prima Materia from ancient philosophy and applied it to their attempts at the transformation of matter. They thought that in order for a given substance to be transformed, it must first be reduced or returned to its original form, undifferentiated state. Bodies cannot be changed except by reduction into their first matter. Again, the species or forms of metals cannot be changed into gold and silver before being first reduced to their primary matter. This procedure corresponds closely to what takes place in psychotherapy. The fixed, settled aspects of the personality that are rigid and static are reduced or led back to their original undifferentiated condition as part of the process of psychic transformation. Return to the Prima Materia is illustrated by the following dream. I am back in a hospital ward. Quote, I am back in a hospital ward. I have become a child again. and I am the word to start my life from the beginning. Okay, let me bring up this next one here. Okay. The dreamer had recently made a suicide attempt, and this dream indicates the symbolic meaning of that act. The child is the prima materia of the adult. This patient's urge for transformation is causing his return to the original condition. In Aristotle's terms, the form that actualizes the present personality is being dissolved and returned to the first matter, the formless state of pure potentiality, in order for a new form of actuality to emerge. This idea is represented by the following dream. Quote, I am having to deal with an infant. Whenever there is something one can't understand, is blocked to, one must approach this infant. At the moment of lack of understanding, the infant glows a faint crimson. This faint crimson glow conveys innocence, which is the material of the infant, and this innocence frees one to approach the problem in terms of one's individual reality. Innocence corresponds to the undifferentiated state of the prima materia. The dream reminds one of the saying of Jesus, quote, Truly I say unto you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven, unquote, from Matthew 18:3 of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. To become like children is to revert to the innocent, undifferentiated state of the prima materia, which is a prerequisite for transformation. Fixed, developed aspects of the personality allow no change. They are solid, established, and sure of their rightness. Only the indefinite, fresh, and vital, but vulnerable and insecure original condition symbolized by the child is open to development, and hence is alive. We consider the image of a child in dreams as one of the symbols of the self, but it also can symbolize the prima materia. We having fun yet? Sean says, my interpretation is God is the vibration, that he is invisible in everything. Surely that is true. Okay, reading on. Often the texts speak of finding the prima materia rather than making it. Its descriptions are innumerable. Here are a few typical examples. Quote, this matter lies before the eyes of all. Everybody sees it, touches it, loves it, but knows it not. It is glorious and vile, precious and of small account, and is found everywhere. To be brief, our matter has as many names as there are things in the world. That is why the foolish know it not. As concerns the matter, it is one, and contains within itself all that is needed. In the same way, Arnold of Villanova writes in his Flower of Flowers, quote, our stone is made out of one thing and with one thing. To the same effect, he says to the King of Naples, quote, all that is in our stone is essential to it, nor does it need any foreign ingredient. Its nature is one, and it is one thing. And Rosiness says, know that the object of your desire is one thing, out of which all things are made. The substance that we first take in hand is mineral. It is a great inward virtue, though it is vile to the sight. It is Saturn's child, Do you need more? Conceive it aright, for it is our first entrance. It is sable-colored, with argent veins appearing intermixed in the body. It is of a venomous nature. There is in our chemistry a certain noble substance, over whose beginning affliction rules with vinegar, but over whose end joy rules with mirth. The problem of finding the prima materia corresponds to the problem of finding what to work on in psychotherapy. These texts give us some hints. 1. It is ubiquitous, to be found everywhere, before the eyes of all. This means that psychotherapeutic material likewise is everywhere, in all the ordinary, everyday occurrences of life. Moods and petty personal reactions of all kinds are suitable matter to be worked on by the therapeutic process. Two, what's coming to mind is Jordan Peterson and his Antidote to Chaos, and this image comes up. This is chaos, and so his 12 rules of life are an antidote to this chaos. 2. Although the great inward value, the prima materia, is vile in outward appearance and therefore despised, rejected, and thrown on the dung heap, the prima materia is treated like the suffering servant in Isaiah. Psychologically, this means that the prima materia is found in the shadow, that part of the personality that is considered most despicable. Those aspects of ourselves most painful and most humiliating are the very ones to be brought forward and worked on. 3. It appears as a multiplicity, has as many names as there are things, but at the same time is one. This feature corresponds to the fact that initially psychotherapy makes one aware of one's fragmented, disjointed condition. Very gradually, these warring fragments are discovered to be differing aspects of one underlying unity. It is as though one sees the fingers of a hand touching a table at first only in 2 dimensions, as separate, unconnected fingers. With 3-dimensional vision, the fingers are seen as part of a larger unity, the hand. 4. The prima materia is undifferentiated, without definite boundaries, limits, or form. This corresponds to a certain experience of the unconscious that exposes the ego to the infinite, the apeiron. It may evoke the terror of dissolution or the awe of eternity. It provides a glimpse of the pleroma, the increatum, the chaos prior to the operation of the world creating logos. It is the fear of the boundless that often leads one to be content with the ego limits one has rather than risk falling into infinite by attempting to enlarge them. And so he says, see figures 1, 3, and 1, 4. You've been looking at figure 1, 3, and I will give you 1, 4 here. So that is figure 1, 4, and again we're looking at the prima materia, or chaos. And Gradon says, Skip, I have a question. Is nirvana in Hinduism explaining the same concept as pleroma and also the kingdom of heaven in Christianity? Well, first of all, nirvana is in Buddhism. I'm not sure it's in Hinduism. It may be, though. But I would say yes to the first part of the question. As to the second part, the kingdom of heaven and Christianity, I'm unsure that's how it's been sold. And let me just bring myself back up here so you can see my mirth with this. As far as it being the same as the kingdom of heaven in Christianity, I'm always reminded of the joke about the guy who shows up in heaven and St. Peter's taking him down the passageway, and there's an open door, and St. Peter says, well, that's the Jews in there. And there, he goes along, there's another open door, and he says, that's the Catholics in there. And then they come to a closed door, and St. Peter says, and that's the Baptists. They think they're alone up here. So I'm not sure that Christianity, as it's come down to us, is like that. Certainly in Gnosticism, the Gnostics came up with the idea of the pleroma, but I'm not sure that that really got adopted by the Catholic Church. Do I know the mineral, Sean says, do I know the mineral boron, which is in raisins, is made from supernova? No, I don't, but then all elements are made by supernova, I think. And Lewis Oscar says Chronos. And Warren says, true, I see this in certain personality types that have chaos in their lower function in terms of intuition. Yep. Intuition can certainly be chaotic. I agree with that. Martin, sensors are on an axis with intuition. Yes, correct. Sensing and intuition on the second axis of the Myers-Briggs. Okay, carrying on. The operations. It is very difficult to understand alchemy as we find it in the original writings. We encounter a wild, luxuriant, tangled mass of overlapping images that is maddening to the order-seeking conscious mind. My method of ordering the chaos of alchemy is to focus on the major alchemical operations. After the Prima Materia has been found, it has to submit to a series of chemical procedures in order to be transformed into the philosopher's stone. Practically, all of alchemical imagery can be ordered around these operations, and not only alchemical imagery. Many images from myth, religion, and folklore also gather around these symbolic operations, since they all come from the same source, the archetypal psyche. There is no exact number of alchemical operations, and many images overlap. For my purposes, I have chosen 7 operations as the major ones making up the alchemical transformation. They are calcinatio, solutio, coagulatio, sublimatio, mortificatio, separatio, and conjunctio. I use the Latin terms instead of calcination, solution, and so on, in order to distinguish the psychological processes from the chemical procedures. Each of these operations is found to be the center of an elaborate symbol. Each of these operations is found to be the center of an elaborate symbol system. These central symbols of transformation make up the major content of all culture products. They provide basic categories by which to understand the life of the psyche, and they illustrate almost the full range of experiences that constitute individuation. In subsequent chapters, I shall take up each of these operations in turn. Each will be accompanied by a chart indicating the major symbolic connections that cluster around the core image. The charts are an important part of my method because I want to emphasize the structural nature of each symbol system. Although I shall try to be clear and explicit, the nature of the subject requires that much be left on the level of image and symbol. In justification, I offer these remarks by Jung. Quote, "We should not begrudge the alchemists their secret language. Deeper insight into the problems of psychic development soon teaches us how much better it is to reserve judgment instead of prematurely announcing to all and sundry what's what. Of course, we all have an understandable desire for crystal clarity, but we are apt to forget that in psychic matters, we are dealing with processes of experience, that is, with transformations which should never be given hard and fast names if their living movement is not to petrify into something static. The protean mythologism and the shimmering symbol express the processes of the psyche far more trenchantly and, in the end, far more clearly than the clearest concept. For the symbol not only conveys a visualization of the process, but, and this is perhaps just as important, it also brings a re-experiencing of it, of that twilight, which we can learn to understand only through inoffensive empathy, but which too much clarity only dispels." And that's from Alchemical Studies, Collected Works 13, paragraph 199. And so let me come back to you here. Let's see. Lewis says when you were talking about Saturn, I'm sorry, I don't know whether you're referring to me on that or someone on the chat. Just to give you an order of magnitude, I'll just show you the beginning of the Calcinatio chapter, which has this map of the various images that relate to Calcinatio. And as I said, we are discussing in excruciating detail the images of alchemy through our Mysterium Conjunctionis seminar, which is the advanced reading group seminar. And so if you're interested in that, please send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will be happy to add you to the advanced reading group. We meet on Zoom every Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern U.S. time, and the reason for that time is that it is a time that people are awake as far west as Hawaii and as far east as perhaps Istanbul or something like that. And so it gives the broadest possible number of people the ability to participate. We have currently 43 members of the advanced reading group, of whom between 6 and 7 have been showing up every week, and the other members typically follow on playback during the next few days after that. So I see we have a good group here today, so I'd be happy to discuss any other matter that you want to ask about at this point. I would ask you all to support this YouTube channel by sharing the videos that you like with your social network, particularly on Reddit. Reddit has been very good. Every time somebody puts one of the videos on Reddit, we add about 50 or 60 followers that day, and on Twitter and Facebook. So all you would have to do is subscribe on the place to subscribe below, and we want to maintain the benchmark of having more than 50% of our viewers as subscribers, and we have done that. I asked you to do that a couple weeks back, and the number of subscribers went up from 48% to 52% almost immediately, and I'm grateful for that. And we also support super chats here on the chat during live streams. So if you wanted to buy me a cup of coffee, that would be welcome, and you could do that right here on the chat where the little $ is, or you can support through Patreon. So am I on Reddit? I'm not sure it matters if I'm on it. It matters if you're on it. So unless I'm not clear about how it works, I was posting things to Reddit, and then what I discovered was that when I post my own things, it doesn't do anything. But there is a Jung, in fact, there's 2 or 3 different Jung groups, Reddit areas on. Thank you very much, Grenade. I appreciate that. That's very much appreciated. But anyway, there are several Jung groups on Reddit, and so they seem to be interested in what we're doing. And so we often get new subscribers through that. And Sean says, the Romans had an interesting role in synthesis to all the living religions from their conquered land. The task of blending the collective unconscious seems susceptible to catastrophe. I would say that's definitely true, Sean, and you need to go back to the beginning of the Red Book in Dr. Jung talking about the way of what is to come, and the way of what is to come involves there will be blood, and that's what the Romans were doing, and they were breaking down things and then putting them back together one way or another, and it's a bloody process. I mean, I actually wrote an essay on this, so maybe I should give you a link to the essay. Let's see. Not finding it right away here in my list. Okay. Sorry, if you go on to archetypeinaction.com and up in the search, put there will be blood, the words there will be blood, it'll pop up the different versions of that essay for you. It's called There Will Be Blood, and it's in archetypeinaction.com. I don't know if I'm allowed to even do that, but I think I can put a link. And so if you just go to that website and put in There Will Be Blood, you can find my essay. And also read I think it's the 3rd Sermon to the Dead. You can find that on the homepage of this YouTube channel. And the 3rd Sermon to the Dead, I think that's the one that's about Abraxas. And Abraxas is this god who decides things in a very rough way, and that's the way human beings have always done it. And I have this mala from the local Tibetan Buddhists. As you see, this has 12 skulls in a mala that one can wear on the wrist. And the idea of it is to remind you of death and the fact that you have to, as the medieval monks used to say, memento mori, you have to remember death. And because, as Dr. Jung once said about a woman, 5 minutes after she's dead, she won't remember this life. And so if you're going to make a difference in the universe during your contribution to the mosaic, the great mosaic of life, you have to do it in this life, not up there hoping that St. Peter's going to put you in the right room, because that ain't happening. As we often say, when you're dead, you don't know you're dead. It's only difficult for your family and friends. And when you're stupid, it works the same way. So I urge you to make the most of this life. Go out and get a life. Don't rely on something that's going to be afterlife. I think the Muslim suicide bombers who thought that they were going to get 72 virgins in heaven after they committed suicide. Well, I can't say what actually happened to them, but I'm not very hopeful that they got the 72 virgins set, which is a true shame, and it's an example of how religious personalities can manipulate our lives in very inappropriate ways. Renat says, sometimes I forget yesterday, let alone this life. And Sean agrees. I can say I forget the beginning of this live stream. And the older I get, the worse it gets. But anyway, and Sean says, I'm not a big fan of reward system thinking. I think that's the best way, that you have to find your own inner reward for whatever you're doing. And that isn't in the form of a material object. Because, let's suppose that someone gives you that boat that I keep showing everybody, but I'll put on here once more if I can find it quickly. Here it is. Okay, so let's suppose you win this yacht in some sort of contest, and so somebody gives it to you, and it's all yours, tax-free. Great. Well, good luck to you, because now you have what you have is a hole in the water into which you throw money, and so it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be happy. And so the reward system, I think we see our president, who has lived the life of King Midas, let's say, with some setbacks, of course, but everybody thinks that, wow, isn't that special that he has his own tower in New York City and his own airplane and blah, blah, blah. Well, is he happy? I mean, is there anybody in the United States that thinks the President of the United States is happy? And of course, King Midas would, everything he touched turned to gold, including his daughter. And here the president has pulled together his family, and are they happy? I don't know. I think it might be very tough to be happy in their situation. Sean says, I've gone through that archetype of the never enough, but my context is that I never have enough equipment. Yeah, that's a problem. I bought a boat, not that big, but a nice sized boat at one point with a partner. And the very first time we took it out, and it was a sizable boat, it's 27 feet. We took it out on the Chesapeake Bay, and it started to go over some fairly sizable waves, and bang, bang, bang. And the first thing we said to one another when we went out on this boat is, we need a bigger boat. And, that's true no matter how big your boat is, because I've been on cruise ships, 1,000-foot long cruise ships, 140,000 tons, which is 1.5 times the size of a U.S. aircraft carrier. And at sea, in a storm, they still bounce around, so you can never get a big enough boat. And John says, I try to remind people to go back to their heart, because that's what really matters. You can make an amazing song with just 2 sticks from outside. Well, it's amazing to someone. Right. I don't know what 2 sticks would be, though. Are you a drummer? Anyway, obviously that is, you can do things in a very simple way. I mean, the most popular song in history is the Happy Birthday song. And I'm not sure that the people that wrote that even had an instrument available to them when they wrote it. They just wrote it, and it's the most successful song in history. So go figure. You don't need these days. I mean, look what we have here in this YouTube channel. We now have over 3,400 subscribers to this channel, and it was built basically on nothing but my willingness to talk to a camera on my desk. And I guess it pays to be an introvert, because an extrovert would have a hard time not having any interaction. Okay, I'm still not quite understanding what you mean of it as a tool, 2 sticks. But anyway, I'm sure as a songwriter you know what you mean, and I don't quite know. But anyway, I do appreciate you all being here today. I'm going to consider reading the rest of this book. If you think you would like to see that, let me know. Also, I want to mention this book. Some of you heard me mention it before. This is Catafalque by Peter Kingsley, and it's Carl Jung and the End of Humanity. It's a 2-volume set. Let's put it this way so that the 1 and 2 are in the right order. The second volume is the footnotes, but what I really like about this book is that Peter Kingsley has discovered the shortcomings of the Jungian community. So I'm going to read to you the back cover here. Thank you, Gray. So here's the back cover. Here at last is the true Jung. The Jung whom those who dare to call themselves Jungian have forgotten and betrayed. A Jung who often is far too frightening to be understood. Nothing could be less comforting than this Jung, or less comfortable than this book, pointing as they do to the extraordinary failure of Western civilization to return to its roots, pay respect to its ancestors, and listen to its dead. And that is a quote from Maggie Anthony, who is the author of Salome's Embrace and Jung's Circle of Women. And this front cover is a painting called The Flower of Chernobyl. And the significance of this is that it looks like a catafalque. And a catafalque is a platform on which you place a coffin. And so it's a very interesting read. I'm about halfway into the book, and it's a very serious eye-opener, but it's worth reading. So I urge you to do it. And if you are a member of one of our Dropboxes, you can find it in the Collected Works subfolder in electronic form. Ultimately, you're going to want a hard copy of it, however, because of the two-volume form, where the second volume is the footnotes. Unfortunately, on the electronic version, the footnotes come at the end of the PDF, and so it's very hard to follow those footnotes, and so you miss all of volume 2, which is a big deal, a really big deal. But it's hard to explain in a few words. It's a 450-page long book in the narrative part in volume 1, and then it's a whole another book in the footnotes. So pays to carry dynamite as well. Yeah, and that came to my mind as I was thinking of Robert Frost's poem today, Mending Wall. Something there is that doesn't love a wall. And so, anyway, so it's been lovely to have you and have a good following here today. I'm trying to find the right time to reach people, and this time of around noon Eastern time on business days seems to work pretty well. When I'm just doing a pickup reading, I'm just trying to keep the material coming to you. And so yesterday I purchased The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James, and I immediately realized that there are some important provisions in there which relate to the genesis of Dr. Jung's work, because William James's book was published in 1902, and as many of you know, having a religious experience is an important aspect of what we're talking about, because if you don't have such an experience, you won't get it. And it's the basis of Alcoholics Anonymous, among many other issues. And so I have talked about my personal religious experiences many times, but I want to read William James and see what he's referring to. He too had an experience where he was lost in the bush somewhere and almost died, but he had a religious experience that saved him, and therefore he became an early psychologist. And so I will be looking at that the next few days. So anyway, I'm going to stop yammering on here and urge you all to take a look at those books, and particularly this one, since I've been reading it today, The Anatomy of the Psyche, Alchemical Symbolism and Psychotherapy by Edward F. Edinger, and I believe you can find that in the Dropbox also if you take a look. So you can see these books in electronic form. For me, they're not very useful in electronic form because, as you see here, I marked up catafalque quite a bit. And I use these little plastic flag tags. So there's lots of information here, and we all have to think about these issues. And Granat says, did you know AA wouldn't be around without Carl Jung? Yes, I did know that. And there's actually a book that I have on my shelf called Carl Jung and Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a very good book to pay attention to because it really explains what happened with Bill W. and with Roland H. And so I highly recommend that. Let's see, I can reach across to it, I think. Let's see. All right. I guess I'm going to have to put it closer to myself on my shelf. But this is the book, Carl Jung and Alcoholics Anonymous, The 12 Steps as a Spiritual Journey of Individuation by Ian McCabe, published by Karnak. And even if you're not an alcoholic, I think it's an incredibly good read, and it's a very, very interesting book to understand, and to understand a 12-step program, because it does amount also to an individuation cycle. And so that's what we're all driving at with Jungian psychology. And Sean says, thanks, I've been keeping crystal rocks on my desk and can feel the energy shift. I definitely have felt that, Sean, at another time of my life when 31 years ago, when my brother was dying up in Pittsburgh, and he had been through, count them, 3 liver transplants. It was a very upsetting time for me, and I had an amethyst stone at that time, and it so happened that that particular amethyst stone was shaped like a heart, and I would put the amethyst in my palm of my hand with the point of the heart into my palm, and when I would pick it up and hold it in that way, it would immediately make me calm down. And if I set it aside, my level of anxiety would just go boom, 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 right up. And then if I picked it up again and put it in that place, it would calm me right down again. And so call it what you will, that's my experience, and it's a real experience that happened to me. Now, for those of you that don't understand about gemstones, let's just talk about crystals for a moment. There are all kinds of, what should we say, vibrations going through the atmosphere at all times. And the crystal will pick up certain of those, and in the early 20th century, they were able to turn those into radio sets. So the early radios in the 20th century were based on crystals, and I actually had a small crystal set when I was a Cub Scout over 60 years ago, where it was just a little box, and it had this little crystal in it and a little needle, and you'd put your needle in different places and it would pick up different frequencies, and you could actually hear different radio stations through that. So there's no question that crystals do convey information and they pick things up. And by experience, people who are adept at these things have figured out which crystals will cause which results in the psyche. And, that's absolutely true in my view. And the other sort of wooey-woo new agey thing that people talk about is auras. And there's no question that you can see your aura, and the easiest way to do it is to hold your hands up like this and just stare at the space between your fingers, move your fingers up and down, and if you have a slightly dark background to that, you'll see a light that goes between your fingers, and as you move your fingers up and down, you can see the light goes up and down like taffy, and you can spread it out and you can wrap it up in a ball, kinds of things. And so that's just a fundamental way of seeing an aura, but you can see auras around people's heads, and they're the basis of halos in medieval paintings, for example, where people would see these auras. Now, that and $3.50 might get you a basic coffee at Starbucks. I don't know what it really does for you, but there's lots of things that we don't know about very well scientifically that we could know a lot more about. So Sean says, I put the big rock near a Buddha statue in my front yard and let the sun heat it to restore the healing energy. That's a school solution, Sean. Martin says, I think they intuitively place themselves on points in the body. Yes, I think they do. And Martin says he carries a black obsidian. But I mean, these ideas of using crystals and gemstones date back to early alchemy and even before, perhaps, and it was basically purely experiential, what people were doing and the results that they were getting. And certainly when my brother was dying, I was pretty upset, and I was 41 at the time, and it was very tragic because my brother was 39 years old, and believe it or not, here's the story. Believe it or not, he had been in Vail, Colorado, and for 15 years. When he graduated from college in 1970, there were no jobs around. And it turned out he was ineligible for the draft. So he said, well, the heck with this, I'm going skiing. So he went up to Vail, and he started working as a busboy in a posh restaurant up there, and gradually became a waiter. And then after about 8 or 10 years, he actually got on the Vail Ski School docket. And so he was teaching very wealthy people how to ski. But one summer, in the summer of 1973, Vail had a problem because there was a drought, and the water table went down to a point where they couldn't do an intake into the water treatment plant for the city of Vail, or for the village of Vail, whatever it is. And so there wasn't any water. And in the summertime, there were only about 300 people in Vail. And so what they did was they took a tank trailer around to the water supply of Vail and filled the tank truck up with water. Except the problem is the water was from the Colorado River, and the Colorado River is known to have this amoebic creature called Giardia. And if you drink water that has that in it, it gets into your colon and it gradually works its way up to your liver, and ultimately it eats your liver. And so Thomas Starzl, who was the founder of human liver transplant in the United States at the time, Dr. Thomas Starzl was on the faculty, I think, of the University of Colorado at Denver, or the University of Denver, I'm not sure which, but I think it's the University of Colorado at Denver. And he, at the time, was experimenting with doing liver transplants on pigs. He hadn't worked his way up to humans, but all of a sudden he had, by synchronicity, because he happened to be the expert in this field, he had many patients coming in from Vail who were having liver failure. And so they discovered what had happened, where the bad water had been brought into the town of Vail. And so everybody that was in Vail that summer either had a liver transplant or they died at some point later on. It actually took 15 years to work its way through my brother's system and ultimately get him to the point where he had to have his liver transplanted. But Dr. Starzl was following all these patients, and then in the course of that 15-year period, he started to do transplants on them, and he moved to Presbyterian Hospital in Pittsburgh for his main place. And so my brother had been one of his first patients, and he did a liver transplant, and for 6 weeks it seemed very good. And this was in the summer of 1988. It seemed very good, and he was very chipper, my brother was. He felt strong, and then his body started to reject this liver, and then when it rejected, they decided to give him a second liver. They started the operation, and my mother and father had waited 18 hours for the first operation because the liver transplant is a very complicated procedure. And my mother and father had waited 18 hours in the waiting room for my brother to come out of surgery. And the second time they said, well, because we have all these sutures in here, it won't take as long to do another liver transplant, so it's going to only take about 8 hours. Well, about 8 hours, well, what ultimately happened was 24 hours passed, and it turned out that they had put a second liver in, and they were taking a smoke break, and while they were taking a smoke break, the second liver failed. And so the result was that they had another liver coming in, which happened to be of the wrong blood type, but they gave it to my brother anyway. And so they gave him his second and third livers in the same procedure that took 24 hours. But unfortunately, very shortly after that, within a week or two, he got infected and he turned septic and then died. And nowadays, it's possible to do a partial liver transplant. And so you can actually give a part of your liver to a sibling, and it won't impair your life in any way. But they weren't doing that back in 1988, unfortunately. So I lost my brother because of that. Anyway, that's a personal story. I'm sorry to bother you with it, but Granada says, I can't normally see auras. I don't think I'm sensitive to them, but when I took a psychedelic in the past, I saw them very clearly. But yeah, it does look almost like a morphing halo around the head. Disclaimer, I don't condone the use of psychedelics, okay? And Sean, I can only imagine the pain in your parents. Yeah, it was very painful. I figured that in a 10-week period, my parents had gone more than 14 miles in the elevators at Presbyterian Hospital. But Sean, going back to your issue about auras, it's very easy. Just go in a semi-dark room, put your hands up like this, and just look at the light between your fingers, and you'll see your aura, the auras there very easily. That everybody I've ever shown that trick to can see them immediately. And then once you see that, then you can become more sensitive because your unconscious starts to believe that you can see them, and then you see them. I mean, I can see it around my own head in the image that I'm looking at on the screen here. Yeah, losing a child or a sibling is obviously a very difficult experience, and it makes you be very sensitive to your own mortality, definitely. And it's hard for me to believe now that at my age I've lived almost twice as long as my brother did. But anyway, that was obviously Vail, Colorado hushed that one up pretty well because they didn't want to hurt their ski business by people finding out what had happened that particular summer. And mind you, it was only because they hadn't been able to get the water from the reservoir through the water treatment plant at Vail. And it just tells you how reliant we are on professionals who do purify our water for us anywhere in the world. And, one of the reasons that when I started to go to India, the average life expectancy there was 52 years for a man. And one of the big reasons for that was the purity of the water. And so you have to be very, very careful about it. And of course, I'm very sensitive about water pollution and have been ever since those days. So anyway, I'm going to move along, and I'll look forward to seeing you another time. I probably will read something tomorrow, but thank you for being with me today. And